Hello, everyone. My name is Moira Forbes, and welcome to The Takeaway, where we speak to top leaders who share their perspectives to help us navigate this defining time and fuel our career growth forward. I'm really excited today to be speaking with Stewart Butterfield, the CEO and co-founder of Slack. Since its launch in 2013, Slack has been popularized in workplaces around the world and has become an essential for so many of us in the wake of the pandemic. Prior to Slack, Stewart co-founded and led the photo sharing site Flickr, and nearly 2 decades working on the web. He has had a distinguished career as a designer, entrepreneur, technologist, and true visionary. Today, we're going to hear about his perspectives on the future of work, given his unique vantage point, how he's continued to master the pivot within the startup space, an experience so many of us have navigated over the past year and a half, and his advice to entrepreneurs. Stewart, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start off because while it's hard to remember what remote work life was like before, Slack, the company has really exploded in the past year and a half, become an indispensable resource for so many of us in terms of staying connected throughout the pandemic. We obviously are not going to go back to work life what it was before the pandemic. This is a new normal. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics that are at play right now and what you think is here to stay and some of the biggest challenges in terms of recalibrating to this very different environment?
Yeah, it's an awesome question. Obviously, something that we've talked about a lot. I had a staff meeting, probably close to 3 months ago, and there's a lot of questions. And so there's a lot of opinions, but also a lot of questions. And this ended up like actually kind of a heated discussion. And one thing that was really helpful for me was our chief people officer, Nadia Rawlinson, said, hold on. Okay, if we're going to talk about what's different in the future, I think we need to be talking about what's different from today rather than what's different from February 2020, because I think it's easier for people to kind of imagine how things were and then kind of imagine a couple of slight tweaks. So when you say, people will only spend 2 days in the office or 3 days in the office, whatever. You're making a lot of assumptions that were true in February 2020. Namely, all employees live within commuting distance of one of your office locations. I think that's probably the biggest, most obvious one. And I think that can lead you down a path that's really misleading. Whereas if you start from where we're at today, it's actually it's nicer as well. Rather than thinking about we're decreasing our number of days in the office from 5 to 3 or 2 or whatever. We're increasing them from 0 to 2. And one way to think about it is life is getting better in many parts of the world and will continue to do so as the pandemic kind of lifts, as more people get vaccinated, and not just the restrictions on what people can do. It's pretty wonderful to go out and have a nice intimate dinner with a group of friends in a crowded restaurant and feel that energy, or go to the theater or dancing or whatever, or just get your nails done or have a massage or any of the amenities of normal life. So it's what we're doing today, which has worked pretty well, plus life is better for most people. And then on top of that, everything's working out, life's better. And we also get the in-person collaboration back as one of the tools in the toolkit. And when you look at it that way, I think there's a lot more possibilities for the kinds of arrangements that people could make. Because while there's this conflation of working remotely and working from home that was necessary during the pandemic, it's obviously not an intrinsic part of not being in the office, because my home and the office are 2 points in a vast world of places that we could be. I don't want to underestimate the power of in-person collaboration. And I think one of the things that's been unclear as a leader, now I think somewhere between 35 and 40% of our employees were hired post-pandemic. And we've actually operated really well. And there's kind of a nagging concern that we're burning down the social capital reserves that had accrued over the last many years. You're kind of using up stored fat, as it were. It's hard to tell, but having that method back as a way of building trust and creating relationships between people, which allows them to operate more effectively, I think will be really wonderful. And many people will end up in working from their homes sometimes, working from offices sometimes. And I think there's other arrangements that will be interesting to explore. So we started, I'm kind of long WeWork now. We started doing WeWork stipends for people who either live in a location where we have an office that isn't yet open, or who just live in a location where we don't have an office because they want that kind of dynamism and energy and having people around. And same reason people go to work at cafes. So I think that'll be a possibility. For the lucky software engineers who work in the Bay Area but want to spend January and February in like Lake Tahoe skiing, they'll have that option. For people who need the flexibility, they have family with health troubles and they want to go back to the Midwest, or just people who want to move a little bit further out of the commuting distance so that they can get a bigger home, have a yard for their kids. I think all of those will become possibilities. So I'm really optimistic. And I guess I'll sum it up by saying I hope that people really view this as an opportunity to reinvent, because you can't go through life questioning everything all the time. But when you have an event like this, I mean, you can really question all the other things that you used to think were impossible, because at least one of them turned out to be possible.
You bring up a great point that I think this is an opportunity for a reset, right? I think there's very few chances in life for us to really take that pause, this universal experience to re-examine and reimagine the future of work. And if it's required this new flexibility, starting from a very, very different playing field than we were a year and a half ago in terms of what it means for the future of work, I'd be curious how the past year and a half influenced you as a leader. Did it stretch or grow you in particular ways, or did it reinforce things that you already knew were fundamental?
Gosh, I mean, it's a little bit of both. And I wish I had a really pithy way of articulating this, but one of the things I found is the more you turn up the volume on the mission, the impact you can have, what's exciting, the kind of the vision, possibilities, the less room there is for concerns and more kind of trivial stuff to arise. So we were in an environment where there was plenty to be concerned about, a lot of uncertainty, and human beings hate uncertainty. And it's not that we don't want to address those questions or have those conversations, but I think it was pretty easy for people to just spin out of control or kind of spiral in this environment. And so it was more important than ever to do things that, of course, are important as a leader. Talk about the impact you're having with customers, or what's exciting, or why people should feel proud of the work they do. It's not that whole world. And you also had to get creative, I guess, with the means of doing that, because we had settled into habits. They served us well. Maybe it could have been better, but it was like the all hands we had every 6 weeks. There's department level meetings. There's show up, different executives kind of cross pollinating each other's department level meetings. But it wasn't like there was a lot of innovation there or a lot of experimentation, and the environment kind of forced in one sense and encouraged in another sense that experimentation. Super valuable. So I think both reinforced things that we already knew and kind of pushed the boundaries and kind of caused us to be inventive, which is nice.
So if you have these sort of two tensions of going back to the fundamentals, we talk about the mission, the purpose, the core things around communication, but also then continuing to stretch and reimagine. Those are tenets, I think, that at least in looking at your career have been hallmarks to so much of what you do. You've built two companies that have fundamentally reimagined the way we communicate, collaborate, share information, Flickr, and obviously Slack. But these companies came out of the ashes of failed projects. You twice launched gaming companies, then pivoted into this startup success. We've talked about pivoting so much again in the past year and a half. It's a word that feels very cliche, but nonetheless fundamental in terms of navigating the opportunities that we have in front of us. I would love for you to talk about Glitch, the company prior to Slack, because that was a company that you had to force to shut down. You had to make the very, very difficult call to switch businesses. Can you talk a little bit about how you've learned to make those decisions that you should know when to quit? So often with entrepreneurs, we're told we should never give up, keep going. Can you talk a little bit about that decision and advice for others in terms of navigating that inflection point?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think you're right that there's so much advice, and in many contexts probably helpful, of perseverance, the little kitten hanging from a branch, or the hang in there, and the almost advising people to like bash their heads through brick walls. And an amount of that is necessary, I think, for success. But part of this just comes from the overall approach I have, and I think there's 3 co-founders, all of whom I worked with at Yahoo. Yahoo bought Flickr and worked with on Flickr, and I think in every case I've now worked with each of them for more than 2 decades. So it's not just me. We have this approach to work that is a little bit more improvisational and taking cues from, in my life, cooking. For many people, team sports, or anyone who's worked in a restaurant, there's this kind of real-time interaction between what everyone else is doing and your understanding of what your role and how you should be participating. So whether you're a bass player in a jazz band, or play right wing on a hockey team, or whatever it is, that approach is less about executing against a very concrete plan that's immutable, and more about the synthesis of all the signal you're getting. It might be from customers, from the team, whoever, and then continually altering course based on that. And I think that makes it a lot easier to pivot. And in one sense, there's fundamental similarities. So you're right, 2 times, once in 2002 and again in 2009, started a company to build a web-based massive multiplayer game. Both failed. But I first got online in 1992, and I think I was just incredibly lucky to discover the internet at that point, because there's maybe 100,000 users worldwide. The web hadn't taken off yet in terms of popularity. So the internet was Usenet, the news groups, it was email, IRC, talk, and a handful of applications. And for someone who grew up, like my second grade class was the first class to have a computer in the classroom. This is, 1980, maybe. I'm pretty old. And kind of grew up with computers at the periphery of our culture and kind of encroaching in. I was less excited about computing in high school, but when I discovered the internet, it was just this powerful thing where you could transcend geography, and people could find their communities, whether it was like breast cancer survivors or model train enthusiasts. It was just the ability to connect with people in ways that you couldn't before. And back then it was all green text on a black screen, ASCII only ways of communicating, and yet people were still expressive and created identities in a way that now they do on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or whatever. So I really looked at the projects as web-based massively multiplayer game, didn't work. Web-based massively multiplayer photo sharing did work. Web-based massively multiplayer game didn't work again. And web-based massively multiplayer workplace software, that one worked. So the use of computing technology to facilitate human interaction is kind of the common thread. And I think I talked to a woman named Annie Duke who wrote the book Thinking in Bets, professional poker player, and she's working on a new book. And we were talking about this mindset that I guess I always assumed everyone had, but maybe not, which is this continual estimation and re-estimation of the odds of something working out. And when we decided to shut down the game that made by this company, that ultimately the same company that made Slack, it was, I just didn't think it could work anymore. And I realized, maybe Henry Ford is right, or I don't know, who knows if he even said it, that whether you think you can or think you can't, you're probably right. It doesn't necessarily follow that you can if you think you can, but I think it almost definitely follows that you can't if you think you can. And once I had lost that, I think it was over.
One of the things that really strikes me about when you talk about the success of your companies, or the hallmark of what you believe is great leadership, comes down to communication and transparency. Can you talk a bit about how that comes to life when you're talking about making a pivot in a company? Because I was struck, I was read, and correct me if I'm wrong with Glitch, some of your board of investors said to keep going. Yeah, obviously, colleagues did, co-founders. You had come to that critical juncture where you didn't feel like the opportunity was still worth it. How do you bring people along, and how have you learned to sort of use storytelling and really hone in on communication as a way to get through these defining moments in a company?
Yeah, my wife Jen and I have this thing where sometimes one of us will do something and then we'll say either the word because or despite, kind of shorthand for I love you despite that, or I love you because of that. I feel like storytelling is the key. And in certain contexts, I can be a good storyteller, but I think a lot of it, the success for me personally is despite, because I'm a little bit too academic, a little bit too intellectual. There's definitely people who are better halftime football coach speech makers than I am. But I maybe there's a because, which is I only say stuff if I believe it. And I think over time, people begin to put some faith in what you say if they believe that you're being authentic, and acknowledging the things that were unknown and the reasons that this might not work out in the context of explaining this larger vision works really well. And it's interesting that you said storytelling, because I think it's really underestimated. So if you look at people who are real fans of Elon Musk, it's like he's a genius engineer, and it's like chemicals that store battery energy longer, or tensile strength of fibers that make up the whatever in the car. Maybe and he's definitely smart, but imagine kind of launching Tesla in 2006. I know he didn't found the company, but he was there really, really early. What a terrible industry. I mean, just like incredibly capital intensive, years and years and years before you can even release a product and find out what the market thinks. In the US, at least, distribution is wonky because of the state level laws about dealerships. The relationship you have with the supply chain, all the parts makers, is critical to your success. It's heavily regulated for safety. There's all of these, it's like 9 strikes against starting a car company. And despite that, he was able to convince talented people to come work there, investors to put their money up, regulators to give them a chance, the kind of whole supply, thousands of partners they have in the supply chain to, in some cases, extend them credit or embark on expensive projects to begin to manufacture parts that they would need. And that's not because of engineering. That's not because of some physics or something like that. That's really because told a story that really captivated people. And ultimately, I think that's what it's all about.
If storytelling, you think, is one of the most underestimated aspects of leadership in terms of bringing people along and really ensuring that people can get behind the vision that you have, you ultimately need those followers to build a thriving team. What do you think are one of the most underestimated qualities in terms of what companies today look for when they hire talent? Is there one quality that sort of defines or that you've really learned to hone in on in terms of building the most effective and dynamic teams, particularly in this environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. We at Slack, we say we really, it's not quite values, it's more like virtues of people. We want people who are smart, humble, hardworking, and collaborative. And it's specifically that combination, because if you look at different subsets, you imagine someone who's smart and hardworking, but neither humble nor collaborative, that doesn't sound like someone you want to work with. And conversely, the collaborative and humble person who's neither smart nor hardworking is also someone you don't want to work with. So it's really that combination. And our CFO, Alan Shim, put it in for his team in terms of company first, team second, individual third. And that's contrary to kind of deep-seated biological or evolutionary tendencies that people have to put themselves first. So it's not, I don't mean to be critical of that at all. But if people aren't humble and aren't collaborative, it's just so much harder. And so I think there's a whole spectrum of attributes. And one of them is the degree to which someone is service oriented or cares about the success of other people, their EQ and ability to read situations and understand interpersonal dynamics, because you talked about the emphasis on communication. For an executive, it's pretty much 100% of your time is spent on communication. Even if you're really introverted, don't like spending a lot of time with people, your energy is going to go into reading what other people have written and writing stuff for them to read. And at the kind of the furthest removed from that inside of a company, the person who spends the least amount of time on internal communication is still probably spending a third of their time. And the average is like, I don't know, 50 or 60 or 70% across the company. Think about a company that's 10,000 employees and therefore, let's say $1 billion in payroll and associated costs. If people are putting half their time into communication, $500 million a year, it's a little bananas how few companies really invest in that, in training people on effective communication or patterns that make sense. And it's so rare that when it does happen, like, Jeff Bezos' famous 6-page Amazon memo, everyone do the read at the beginning of the meeting. We all know it, because there's not that many people really experimenting there.
How do you hire for those qualities? And it's easy to do, or it's much easier to do when you're in those early stages of a startup, a handful of employees. But when you get into the hundreds and now you're in the thousands, how do you hire for that? Is it the way that you recruit? Is it questions that you ask? What are you looking for?
I will say this. I have come to recognize that hiring is not one of my core skills. I'm not a good judge in either direction of people if I only get to spend an hour with them. And so, I'm the opposite of, true or not, the like Larry and Sergey interviewing every single one of the first 4,000 employees. I just realized that there's other people who are better at making that evaluation than I am. But I think imperfect as I am at that, you can kind of see what motivates people or try to unpack what motivates them. My favorite question to ask people is, so at some point you were born and now we're having this conversation, what happened in between? And there's no right or wrong here, but it's really interesting to see if people go for more like life story, biography, or it's more of like a professional resume, like, it starts with their third job out of college and goes to the present day. Because I think it says something about what they think is important. And I don't mean that people who don't mention their childhood are preoccupied with work. It's a good measure of how people see themselves in the context of this company or this role. And I find the answers fascinating. Again, I'm just not great at picking them.
We all obviously have our strengths and weaknesses in terms of our careers. When you are, again, in the early stages, you are wearing most every hat, right? In terms of building a company. Fast forward to today, you're the CEO of a huge company, public company, in a major transition moment. And you talked about sort of your strengths and weaknesses. What has been the biggest change for you as a leader from when you go back to, your early days and the early days of the company to where you are now? And what aspects of that change still remain challenging for you?
Yeah, it's. I think there's one answer to that for me, and both I've made progress and there's still a long way to go. And that's really doing what I ask other people to do, which is, in the case of our employees, put themselves in the mind or the shoes of our customers. And so for me, it's to put myself in the mind or the shoes of our employees, because oftentimes just the experience of being a leader, as you know, is very frequently you're like, how did that happen? Like, how did people come to this very bizarre seeming decision? And I think the immediate tendency many people have, including myself, when they're younger and less mature, is just frustration or anger. Like, those people are stupid. I think what I've made some progress on is trying to tease apart the incentives and the motivations and the interpretations that led people to go down a certain path. Because unless you do that, you can't really make progress. Otherwise, it's unpredictable. We make the decision that we're going to do X, and then maybe X happens, maybe Y happens. And I think there's a long way to go there, but the buck stops here. So if I'm not getting the results that I think we require, then looking harder at how we got there, while discounting these people are stupid or incompetent as a reason for it.
I love that insight. I want to shift gears now. I want to do a really quick speed round. I know we've covered a lot of topics in terms of the vision for the future, how you built your very successful companies. But I want to do a quick speed round just to get some top of mind things on how you do all that you do. So does that work for you?
That sounds great.
Okay, we'll start off. I know you're on the West Coast, so a little bit earlier in the morning. I'd be curious, what do you do in the first 60 minutes of each morning that you think sets you up to have a good, productive day?
Nothing. I know this is speed round, but I got to do this. So when Jack Dorsey came back as CEO of Twitter, maybe I don't know, 2 months after or something like that, I had breakfast with him. It's the first time I talked to him in many, many years. And I was like, man, I can barely be the CEO of one company. I don't know how you do with two. And he was talking about his morning routine, which was like, I don't know, wake up at 5 a.m. and meditate for half an hour. And then there's like an ice bath and yoga and walks 1 hour into work. And only then when he gets to work does he open his phone. And I was like, here's me. Wake up, haven't put my contacts in, haven't brushed my teeth, like all bleary eyed, pick up my phone and then keep on reading messages until I get so stressed that I hop out of bed. So my morning routine is not an example for anyone, and do not do what I do.
Well, clearly it works as long as it works. So yeah, with Jack's morning routine, when I read the stuff he did, I was like, oh my gosh, if I did that in a year, I feel like I would have accomplished a lot. I feel like you meditate more in a day than I have in 4+ decades. So aside from Slack, is there an app or tool that you use in a surprising way to get things done?
There's many, but the first thing that popped in my mind is actually the iOS Notes app. Not because I think it has like some amazing, wonderful feature, but in fact, kind of because it doesn't, because it's so simple and it syncs across devices. And I feel like some absurdly high percentage, 89% of my mental capacity goes into or I'm trying to remember people I'm supposed to get back to or trying to remember something. And so frequent note-taking is incredibly helpful.
Okay, keep it simple. That's what I always say. Simple makes it easier. Is there a piece of commonly accepted business advice that you fundamentally disagree with?
I might pass on that one because I feel like maybe I'm just second guessing a little bit too much, but nothing seems that commonly accepted anymore. I mean, there's two sides to everything.
If you had one superpower you could use in your life, what would it be?
Superhuman discipline, like whatever the anti-procrastination in power would be.
Oh yeah, I need that one too. If you're feeling burnout or stressed or lacking sort of that creative focus, is there one thing that you do to help yourself get unstuck or find your energy?
Yeah, I think it's do something that takes yourself out of the equation. And I think this is not the most effective way. I mean, that can be like playing a stupid iPhone game or, scrolling or something like that. I think the better ones are usually like either getting your body moving, exercise, or something creative like playing music. Because I think you do need times where you just shut up, like the constant monologue. Meditation is actually another path towards that. That's totally legitimate, but it's really hard to have a lot of anxiety when you can barely breathe because you're running on the treadmill so fast or so engrossed in music or whatever.
Oh, that's very true. Yeah, that is the good thing of exercise. The only thing I can think about is not passing out. What's one piece of advice you would give to a young, aspiring entrepreneur today?
No matter what you want or how bad you want it, think more about what other people want and how you can provide it. Because I think that's the weakness of so many people is just what someone on Twitter, when I once asked for a name for this, called the owner's delusion, like belief that your thing is so important that everyone is just going to care about it in the same way that you do. And that's obviously not the case.
Last question in the speed round for you. If you were to look at life in chapters, how would you describe the one you're in right now?
Well, I think, it definitely feels like a new chapter, but partly because we have a 8.5 week old baby. So that's one thing. I think this year has been a close, and I talked to our class of interns yesterday, and one of the things I told them was like, I feel for you because this is a crappy internship. Like you didn't get to go to the office and meet all these people. You didn't have the kind of be able to look over their shoulder and stuff like that. But at the same time, I think this is a moment of real inflection. And so in some sense, I think you're lucky to be starting your careers here because there is a little bit of a reset, and it feels very open, very expansive. And of course, the other thing I didn't mention was the impending close of the acquisition of Slack by Salesforce. There's like a whole bunch of new stuff there. So yeah, it definitely feels like a fresh start, new chapter, a lot to invent and discover.
When you were talking to those interns, is there a quote, a leadership quote or a mantra that you live by that you share when you're, talking to those people in those really, really defining moments of their lives?
There should be. They used to have all kinds of sayings, but I realized that they were a little too opaque and people just ended up confused. It was harder. So sometimes I got to actually lay it out and explain it. But I think what we just talked about, the strong orientation towards the success of others and curiosity just feels so necessary for anything other than like a really narrow advancement in like basic research kind of science. For anything else that involves other people, you got to understand the people.
So it always comes back to the people. I always say like the things that are the most simple in life are the hardest things to actually do and to focus on, but they're the most fundamental. Last question for you, Stewart. The show is called The Takeaway. You've shared a lot of great actionable advice and perspectives, given the really unique vantage point that you have right now. If someone were to look at your life and your career, what would you want at this point in time the takeaway to be? What's the moral of your story when people look at all that you've accomplished, but the path that you're still on right now as well?
I think there's probably a better word for this, but like the improvisational approach, the one that is a little bit more like team sports or playing music or working in a restaurant or wherever, where there is this real-time adjustment. And, if you're a professional soccer player, it's hundredths of a millisecond or hundredths of a second that really make a difference. The time scale is different in most work. Like if you're marketers working on a big launch or recruiters working on a university job fair or something like that. But I think the art of it is the same. And the requirement to be successful there is giving up the idea that your job is to be right on the first try. Your job is to be right at the end. But, when people get faked out by an opponent in a game, they don't like start crying and feel like I made the wrong choice. It's just an immediate adjustment. And the same thing, again, in all those contexts, the music making, whatever it is that is like you think of as a real-time dynamic interaction between actor and environment. That's something that it's hard for people who are earlier in their career to really wrap their heads around, because just the survivorship bias and what you see is people getting praised when they were right. And so it becomes like almost hypnotizing that you got to be right every time. You just have to be right in the end. And
I think that it's always helpful for people to know that those aren't necessarily skills that you're born with, right? That those can be sort of developed and honed over time.
Absolutely.
If you're in the right mindset and put yourself in the right opportunities to do that. I love that. Well, Stewart, thanks so much for joining us. That is the huge takeaway for me. I haven't heard someone sort of talk about leadership in the context of the sort of improv the way that you do. That definitely is going to stick with me. Well, I appreciate all that you shared. Best of luck with the chapters ahead, the upcoming acquisition, the new baby, obviously being such a pivotal and important force for so many of us during the pandemic. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation.
And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next Wednesday back here for The Takeaway.